German comfort women were shocked when British soldiers finally liberated them. The locked door doesn't open from the inside. That's what they were told. Day after day, week after week, in buildings scattered across northern Europe, buildings with curtains drawn tight, where German officers came and went in silence. These women had been promised work, protection, a way to survive. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a system that stripped them of choice, dignity, names. And now, in the spring of 1945, they could hear something new through those locked doors. Gunfire, getting closer. The question wasn't whether liberation would come. The question was whether they would survive long enough to see it. This wasn't supposed to happen. Germany had constructed an elaborate network during the war years, a sprawling infrastructure of control that extended far beyond the battlefield. Military brothels, organized, regulated, documented. Women were recruited, coerced, conscripted from occupied territories and from within Germany itself. Polish women, Ukrainian women, French women, German women deemed antisocial or racially acceptable for such use. The system was efficient, brutal. And by 1944, as Allied forces pressed from the west and Soviet armies surged from the east, that system was still operating. But the ground was shifting beneath it. Britain had transformed since Dunkirk, since the Blitz, since those dark months when invasion seemed inevitable. Now British forces were part of the overwhelming tide pushing into Germany's heartland. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in crucial sectors where resistance crumbled faster than Berlin could reinforce it. German commanders were making impossible calculations. Which cities to defend, which units to sacrifice, which civilians to evacuate. The women in the brothels were not part of those calculations. As British armoured columns advanced through northwestern Germany in April 1945, they encountered towns that surrendered without a shot, others that fought with desperate ferocity. But in every location, there were buildings that the retreating Germans left behind. Buildings with specific purposes. Buildings that British soldiers didn't expect to find. She didn't know if the explosions were coming closer or if she'd just stopped noticing the distant ones. Inside a requisitioned hotel in a town whose name she'd never bothered learning, a young woman from Hamburg sat on the edge of a narrow bed and listened. The routine had been unbroken for months. Officers arrived, used the facilities, departed. Meals appeared at specific times. Medical inspections every week. Everything documented, everything controlled. The building's administrator, a severe woman in her 50s who insisted this was essential war work, had fled 3 days ago. That's when the real fear started. Because if the administrators were running, what did that mean for the women still locked inside? The German military had protocols for retreat. Destroy infrastructure the enemy might use. Evacuate valuable personnel and equipment. Burn documents. But these women existed in a grey zone of official paperwork and unofficial shame. Some had been arrested for prostitution and given a choice between prison and service. Others had been deemed unemployed vagrants. A few had volunteered, believing the promises of safety and wages that rarely materialized. Now they were inventory that didn't appear on any evacuation manifest. Outside, the sounds intensified. Not just artillery anymore. That had been background noise for weeks. But small arms fire. Shouting in German, then silence, then shouting in a language that sounded harsh, clipped, foreign, English. The women pressed themselves against interior walls, away from windows. Some prayed. Some sat in blank-faced shock. Others began searching for anything that could be used as a weapon, though against whom and to what purpose remained unclear. The British soldiers entering the town weren't thinking about brothels. They were thinking about snipers in church towers, about whether that intersection had been mined, about the eerie quiet in streets where white flags hung from windows, but any doorway might conceal a Hitler youth fanatic with a Panzerfaust. The advance had accelerated so rapidly that supply lines strained to keep up, and soldiers pushed forward on adrenaline and momentum, clearing buildings with methodical caution. A corporal from Yorkshire kicked in the door of what he thought was a boarding house. The smell hit him first. Not decay, not death. Something worse in its banality. Unwashed bodies, stale cigarette smoke, cheap disinfectant failing to mask other odours. The foyer was dark. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered across the floor. He'd see dozens of scenes like this. Evidence of panicked departure. But then a sound from upstairs. Movement. His rifle came up. Standard procedure. Call out a warning. British Army! Come down with your hands visible. The silence that followed lasted too long. He could hear his own breathing, the creak of floorboards as other soldiers entered behind him. Then, hesitant footsteps on the stairs. A woman appeared. Mid-20s, gaunt, wearing what looked like a faded evening dress 3 sizes too large. Her hands were raised, shaking. Her eyes went wide when she saw the uniforms. Not German uniforms. She said something in rapid German he couldn't follow. Another woman appeared behind her. Then 3 more. Then 6. All emerging from upper floors like refugees from some nightmare tableau. The corporal lowered his rifle slowly, confusion replacing combat readiness. This wasn't what they'd trained for. This wasn't a firefight or a surrender negotiation. One of the women, older, maybe 40, with greying hair pulled back severely, spoke in broken English. "You are British?" "Yes, ma'am." "We are." She struggled for words, her face twisting, with shame and relief and terror all competing. "We are prisoners. They leave us." That's when the story began to emerge. Not all at once. The women were traumatized, malnourished, terrified of what admission might bring. Some had documents identifying them as registered prostitutes under German military supervision. Others had nothing. No papers. No identity beyond the numbers in ledgers that administrators had burned or taken when they fled. British officers arrived. Military police. A medical officer who took one look at the conditions and started issuing urgent requests for supplies. Translators were found. Statements were taken. The picture they assembled was fragmentary but damning. This building was one node in a network that stretched across occupied Europe. The Wehrmacht had systematized something that followed armies since ancient times, regulating it with typical German thoroughness. Medical checks to prevent disease, quotas for how many clients each woman was expected to service. Pay that was often withheld or negated by mandatory fees for room and board. Women who resisted were threatened with deportation to concentration camps. Women who became pregnant faced forced abortions. The British soldiers listening to these accounts struggled with what to do with the information. Germany was collapsing. The Reich that had seemed invincible 5 years earlier was now being carved apart by Allied armies converging from all directions. Refugees clogged every road. Concentration camps were being discovered with horrors that made hardened soldiers vomit. The civilian population was starving. Cities were rubble. And now this, another category of victim that didn't fit neatly into anyone's planning. Because these weren't prisoners of war. They weren't forced labourers exactly. They weren't concentration camp inmates. The international laws and conventions that governed occupation and liberation didn't account for women who'd been caught in this particular machinery. Some of the liberating soldiers felt anger at the system that had brutalized these women. Others felt disgust at the women themselves, unable to separate victims from collaborators in their exhausted minds. Officers issued contradictory orders. Should the women be detained? Interrogated as potential intelligence sources? Treated as displaced persons? Given medical care and rations that were already desperately scarce? The women themselves had even more complicated calculations to make. Where do you go when the locked door finally opens? For some, the answer was simple. Anywhere but here. They took what meagre possessions they had and disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Walking west toward British lines, hoping to reach relatives or simply to lose themselves in the masses of refugees. Their chances weren't good. The roads were dangerous. Food was scarce. And they carried the shame of what they'd been forced to do like visible brands. Others stayed, too weak or too traumatized to move. British military government units began establishing displaced persons camps, but resources were overwhelmed. Millions of people were on the move across Europe, forced labourers returning east, concentration camp survivors, German civilians fleeing the advancing Soviets, prisoners of war. The women from military brothels were just another drop in that ocean of human misery, and their stories remained largely unrecorded. The British forces pushing into Germany were focused on military objectives: securing surrender, disarming enemy units, preventing partisan resistance. Documenting the industrial scale of Nazi atrocities became a priority as camps like Bergen-Belsen were liberated. But the military brothel system didn't fit the narrative of Nazi evil in the same way. It was sordid, complicated, tinged with the kind of sexual shame that made it easy to ignore. Many of the women never spoke about their experiences again. They went home to families who asked no questions or who asked too many of the wrong ones. They changed their names. They buried those months or years in silence because what language existed to describe what had been done to them? They were victims of a system that Germany would prefer to forget and that Allied nations found easier not to discuss. Meanwhile, the liberation continued across Germany. British forces linked up with American units driving from the south. Soviet armies surrounded Berlin. The Wehrmacht disintegrated from a fighting force into scattered holdouts and mass surrenders. Hitler died in his bunker. The Reich collapsed into rubble and defeat. But for the women emerging from those locked rooms, liberation was not the ending of stories. It was the beginning of an aftermath that would define the rest of their lives. The young woman from Hamburg eventually made it back to her city, or what remained of it. The British had bombed Hamburg in 1943 in raids that created firestorms visible for 200 miles. Her neighbourhood was gone. Her family was scattered or dead. She never found out which. She told no one what had happened to her in that building in that nameless town. When asked about the war years, she said she'd worked in a factory. It was easier that way. She wasn't alone in that choice. Across Germany and occupied territories, thousands of women carried similar secrets. Polish women who'd been taken from their homes returned to a Poland that had been destroyed and remade under Soviet occupation. Ukrainian women faced suspicion or worse for having been in German custody. French women who'd been deported returned to a France conducting its own brutal reckonings with collaboration. German women who'd been forced into military brothels had perhaps the most complicated position of all. Their nation had lost. The moral authority to claim victimhood felt uncertain when their countrymen had perpetrated such monstrous crimes. And German society, struggling with its own guilt and trauma, had little room for complicated narratives about coerced prostitution. The British military government that administered northwestern Germany in the occupation years had more pressing concerns: feeding millions of civilians, preventing disease outbreaks, processing surrender documents, conducting trials of major war criminals. The bureaucratic apparatus that had regulated military brothels was dismantled quietly, its records incomplete or destroyed. Historians would struggle for decades to piece together the full scope of the system. How many women had been forced into it? Tens of thousands, certainly. How many had died from disease, abuse, Allied bombing, or execution by retreating German forces? The numbers remain estimates, educated guesses based on fragmentary documentation. The women themselves rarely provided testimony. Shame prevented many. Trauma silenced others. Death claimed many more before anyone thought to ask, and society preferred not to look too closely at this particular aspect of the war. Liberation didn't heal what had been broken. The British soldiers who kicked in those doors moved on to other towns, other battles, other discoveries. Some would later describe finding the brothels in letters home or in interviews decades later, usually briefly, usually with discomfort. Most never mentioned it at all. It was another piece of the war's darkness, catalogued mentally alongside burned villages and mass graves and shell-shocked children scavenging for food. The machinery of defeat continued grinding forward. Germany was divided, occupied, denazified with varying degrees of thoroughness. Trials at Nuremberg prosecuted major war criminals for crimes against humanity. But the systematic sexual exploitation of women in military brothels didn't feature prominently in those proceedings. It was too common, too ancient, too tied to assumptions about prostitution that even the victorious Allies shared. The women waited in displaced persons camps or returned to shattered homes. Some eventually emigrated, seeking fresh starts in countries that knew nothing of their histories. Others remained, silent presences in reconstructed Germany, carrying memories they couldn't safely share. And the locked doors? Those became metaphors. The physical doors had been kicked open by British boots in spring 1945. But the doors of silence, shame, and societal forgetting remained locked for generations. Only slowly, through patient research, through rare testimonies given late in life, through changing understandings of sexual violence in conflict, did those other doors begin to crack open. The liberation was real. The shock was genuine. When British soldiers appeared in those doorways, many women couldn't process what was happening. They'd been told the British were monsters, or they'd been told nothing, kept so isolated that the outside world ceased to have meaning. The moment of encounter, armed soldiers confronting brutalized women, was charged with fear, confusion, relief, suspicion, all tangled together. Some women collapsed, some screamed, some stood silent, too traumatized to react. The soldiers, expecting combat or surrender, found instead a humanitarian crisis they weren't equipped to handle. Medics did what they could. Officers made decisions based on incomplete information and overwhelming triage across the entire collapsing Reich. It wasn't the triumph that liberation narratives usually describe. There were no flags raised, no jubilant crowds. Just exhausted, damaged women emerging from buildings that had been their prisons, facing an uncertain future in a destroyed country occupied by foreign armies. Britain was on the offensive, yes. Germany was defeated, yes. But this victory revealed not glory, but the human wreckage that total war creates, not just on battlefields, but in the systematic degradation of the vulnerable. The women's shock at liberation wasn't just surprise that British soldiers had arrived. It was the shock of transition from one impossible situation to another. From locked doors to chaos. From controlled exploitation to uncertain freedom. From knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring, however terrible, to having no idea how to survive the day after liberation. There is no clean ending to this story. The last woman who could testify to the full reality of that system is likely gone now. The British soldiers who liberated those buildings are mostly dead. The records are incomplete. The shame persists. The questions remain unanswered. How many? Who were they? What became of them? What we know is that Britain's advance into Germany revealed layers of atrocity. Some industrial, some intimate, all devastating. That liberation was not a simple gift, but a complicated mercy. That the women trapped in that system survived not just Germany's war machine, but also the aftermath's indifference. The locked door opened. But what came next wasn't freedom as imagined in stories of liberation. It was survival, silence, and the long, unfinished work of reckoning with what humans do to each other when systems of control meet the chaos of collapse. The British soldiers moved on. Germany rebuilt. The women carried their memories into decades of silence. And the story remains unfinished, because some doors, once locked, leave marks that never fully open.